So let me just start by saying a few words. First of all, welcome everybody. This is the 2025-2026 edition of the Lugano Philosophy Colloquia. It's organized by varieties, which is there, and yours truly, with the generous support of the Institute of Philosophy and of the Lugano-based SNS founded projects, Temporal Existence, Intentionality in Mathematics, and Quantum Invariance. The colloquia is, as you know, a series of events where selected researchers have the chance to tell us about their ongoing work. It is also part of a course of the MAP, the Lugano Masters in Philosophy, where our students can write an essay in response to one of the talks they select. So if you're a student of the MAP and you are taking this course for credits and you have questions, just reach out to either Byron or myself, either after this talk or by email. Okay. Good. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Fabrice Correia. Fabrice is the chair of analytic philosophy at the University of Geneva. He's also a professor here at the MAP, as you will know, where he teaches about mereology, location, among other things. And by the way, Fabrice is here right after the lecture, so we're doubly grateful for that. So Fabrice has done a number of contributions in metaphysics and philosophical logic on a range of topics, including the nature of metaphysical necessity, identity, ground, definition, time. Some of his work you can find in the form of books. So let me just mention the latest, which is The Logic of Grounding, 2024 for Cambridge University Press. So Fabrice, thanks again for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction and for inviting me. As Andrea just said, I've just lectured for quite some time. I was standing, so now I'm sitting. And I just only hope that my brain is not going to explode during the talk or the Q&A. So I'm presenting joint work with Sven Rosenkranz. We presented this very paper a month ago in Bergen. So he was present, I was on Zoom. He wrote down the first half of the slides. I did the second half. Now I'm going to present both halves. So obviously I'm if more confident with the second part, but hopefully I'm not going to mess up the first one, I think. So what's the, oh, okay. Maybe the mouse works. Okay, I have to be on the, well, that's fine. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? The starting point is Kit Fine's well-known classification of tense views about tense, tense-realist views, to be more precise. And what he does in the book and the paper that in the two papers that are mentioned here is set up a type of McTaggart dilemma. Okay, works on it and gets this classification of tense-realist views from it. Now, in a paper that Sven and I wrote in 2012 called Eternal Facts in an Aging Universe, I think, we tried to show that Fine forgot one view, which we call dynamic absolutism, and he forgot it because he had, in his, when formulating his McTaggartian argument, he used basically a given a certain assumption, which is not trivial, right? So once you take that assumption into account, then you realize that there's a view, there are more views than the one that he listed. Okay. Now, both Fine's taxonomy and our taxonomy construe the various views about various tense-realist views in terms of first order quantification over facts. Okay, so we first quantify over facts in the first order way, so to speak, right? And then there is the question of what happens if you decide not to do that way, if you decide to use higher order quantifiers, and more specifically sentential quantifiers to quantify over facts, so to speak, right? So the aim of the presentation, the paper, is to show that we can preserve all the first order views in the higher order setting. So that's the aim. So in order to do so, we first modify our own 2012 way of doing things. We modify it to make it more perspicuous and simple in such a way that then the translation from first order to higher order languages is made easier. Okay. All right. And then you might ask, well, what's the interest of doing it that way? So actually, the paper was triggered by a recent paper by Lukas Skiba, okay, where he argues that when you move higher order to the higher order formulations of these views, then there is simply no room for dynamic absolutism. So the view that Sven and I defended in that in the paper I mentioned. Okay, so what we do here, among other things, is in particular reply to Skiba and say, look, no, this very view is still with us when we move higher order. Now, as you will see, the way of going higher order is not completely trivial because Skiba has a real point here. So you will tell me what you think about the way we move to the higher order level. So first, the background, so fine classification and the hidden assumption that I've mentioned before. So as you may know, this classification is based on an argument that has four different premises: realism, reality is constituted at least in part by tense facts, neutrality, no time is privileged, the tense facts that constitute reality are not oriented towards one time, namely the present, as opposed to another. Absolutism, the constitution of reality, is an absolute matter. It's not relative to time, or to any other form of temporal standpoint. And finally, coherence. Reality is not contradictory. It is not constituted by facts with incompatible content. So we really reproduce exactly the phrasing up with that Fine uses. Okay, so his argument for the inconsistency, I'm going to read it completely. The argument for inconsistency goes as follows. He says, it follows from realism that reality is constituted by some tense fact. There will therefore be some time t at which this fact obtains. Now, neutrality states that reality is not oriented towards one time as opposed to another, so reality will presumably be constituted by the similar sorts of tense facts that obtain at other times. But this means as long as temporal reality is sufficiently variegated, that quantification is crucial, come back to that some of these facts will have incompatible content. If reality is constituted by the present fact that I'm sitting, for instance, then it may well be constituted by the subsequent fact that I am standing. This is then contrary to coherence and the underlying assumption of it. That's the argument verbatim. Now, in the light of this argument, he builds his classification of tense-realist views. He calls presentism or standard realism the rejection of neutrality. So if you're a realist and you reject neutrality, then you're a presentist in that sense, in his sense. Then comes relativism. You accept neutrality, but you reject absolutism. And finally, there is fragmentalism, which accepts both neutrality and absolutism, and therefore rejects coherence, because coherence is incompatible with by this argument, it's incompatible with the other principles. Okay, so that's his classification, three kinds of tense-realist views. Now, what we argued in the 2012 paper is that, as I said, Fine's reasoning involves a hidden premise, which is a general principle that concerns the content of tense facts, and we call this principle fixed content. If at a given time, a given tense fact is the fact that P, that Kitfine is sitting, for instance, then at all times at which it constitutes reality, it is also the fact that P. Okay, the content doesn't change across time. Once the fact that P, forever the fact that P. That's the thought. Now, we argue that this principle is optional, okay, and that there is a viable version of tense-realism that endorses neutrality, absolutism, coherence, but reject fixed content, okay. And we call that view dynamic absolutism. That's the missing view in his classification according to Sven and I. Now, if you reject fixed content, if you say, look, and it's not true that once the fact that P, then always the fact that P, then you should find something to replace it, because facts won't change their content completely in a chaotic manner. Presumably, they will change their content in an orderly manner. And we have this shifty content principle instead, which says, so don't read it, well, if you want to read it, but the idea is that if the fact, if X is the fact that I'm sitting, is now the fact that I'm sitting, then in 1 hour, it will be the fact that I was sitting an hour ago. Okay, the content changes from I am sitting to I was sitting an hour ago, and so on and so forth. Okay, so constantly facts change their contents over time. That's shifty content. So we claim that this is the most plausible alternative to fixed content. If you reject fixed content, that is the most reasonable thing to say. Okay. So that's the way we formulate neutrality. Fine doesn't talk about the present time, but that's what he means. I think when he formulates that's what he has in mind when he formulates the principle. So thought is that what he has in mind is the principle that at the present time, some tense fact constitutes reality, and at some other time, too, some tense fact constitutes reality. That's the natural interpretation of what he has in mind. Now, remember Fine's argument. He talks about realities being variegated, and that plays really a central role in the argumentation. So we assume, or we claim, that he has the principle that we call variegation in mind in the background when he formulates his argument. And the principle says that for some mutually incompatible P and Q, at the present time, reality is constituted by the tense fact that P, while at some other time, reality is constituted by the tense fact that Q. So that's variegation. It's not that you have the same fact, fact that P, fact that P, fact that P. It's something stronger than that. So variegation entails, of course, neutrality is stronger. It says not only that you have facts, tense facts at different times, but it says that there is this qualitative variation, if you wish, in facts across time. Okay, so now that's the thing. Now I come to the second part of the talk, where we reformulate our own taxonomy of first order views about facts, making some slight corrections, keeping this very spirit, but making some corrections, some modifications, which are first more conspicuous, and second, which will help us just move on to the higher order level. So some simplifications have already been made in the 2012 paper. So when Fine talks about constituting reality, we prefer to talk about existence. Okay, we don't think that anything is lost by doing that. We know that some people disagree with us, and Fine in particular, right? But we never heard any arguments that would have forced us to change our mind on this. Now, another modification, content attribution in all the claims that you've seen before, take the shape X is identical with the fact that P. So that's how we introduce, how we express content attributions. You identify an object with the fact that P, or the fact that Q, or whatever. That's the way we do it. Now, we simplify things here. We use the less theoretically involved locution X has the content at P. Okay, so that locution could be interpreted as X is identical with the fact that P, but it doesn't need to be so interpreted. It's a more neutral way of expressing content attributions, and for that reason, we're happy to use that simpler and more general kind of formulation. Remember, coherence and variegation make use of the notion of facts having incompatible contents. Okay, Kitfine is sitting, Kitfine is standing. These are incompatible. Contents. There is some, controversy about how exactly to construe this notion of incompatibility. So we simplify things by simply speaking of opposite contents. So contents are opposite when one is just the negation of the other. So Kitfine is sitting, Kitfine is not sitting. So that's pure logical opposition or inconsistency. And so there's no discussion about how to understand that. Right? Okay, now I move on to the kind of language that we use to formulate the first order classification and the first order principles that give rise to the classification. It's very precise. It was the audience in Bergen was a very logical audience, so that's why we went through the detail. But it's not everything is important. I'm going to just highlight the important points there. So everything is formulated in the first order language of the identity, and then you enrich the language with special predicates and operators, and then the language that you So we talk about time, so we have a predicate for times. We talk about presentness, so we have a predicate for presentness. We have sentential variables, okay, because we want to quantify over contents. We want to say things like for some P, X is the fact that P, so we have that. We have a standard temporal operators, always in the past, always in the future. Something that is non-standard, if you wish. We have a content identity connective, okay, where these connective expresses content identity. And we have a content attribution connective. So remember, the content attributions now take the form X has the content at P, and that's what these prenective, so have predicate, have connective expresses. And we have the truth at prenective as well. So the position is true at the time that we'll also use, and that appears basically really in the English version of the finds argument. Okay, so individual terms we use tau, tau1, etc. For sentential terms alpha, beta, etc. Here you have like the construction rules that are completely trivial, nothing special. You define other notions in terms of the basic vocabulary, material implication, and so on. Other temporal operators, sometimes in the past, sometimes in the future, in terms of the other ones. That's all completely standard. There's nothing special here. Now a few words about the two special connectives that we introduce here. First, the content identity connective. Well, you read this alpha triple bar beta as, you may read it as the content that alpha is and the content that beta are one and the same. No surprise. And then we read things like tau with the content attribution connective alpha as tau has the content at alpha. So that's just the intended interpretation. Okay. Importantly, that's not going to be crucial for today, I guess, but it looks like, so look at the gloss on the content identity claim. The content that alpha and the content that beta are the same or identical. This sounds like regular first order predication. Okay. Now the idea here is that you don't have to read them that way. You could read them, you could understand them like higher order metaphysicians like to understand them. Namely, these are claims that involve sentences and not singular terms for contents, right? But this is the best English approximation that we could come up with, as Tim Williamson, who's a who's a proponent of higher order metaphysics, says there's no way in English to pronounce these things correctly. We just have to immerse in that language and learn to use it. And the best we can do when we use English is have approximations of what we want to say, which are misleading because they suggest like the first order idiom. Okay, right. So that is where at time tau alpha, no problem. Some principles governing all these things, we don't need to care about that. It's not really crucial. A few words about the logic. Again, so the audience there was really very logical, so we don't need to go into all the details. There are a few points which are super important, nevertheless. Classical propositional logic, no problem. Standard identity works like classical identity. We don't need to insist on that. Now, for higher order, for first order quantification, we use a free logic because if you have classical logic, then you will have as a theorem that everything always exists. So facts will be eternal, absolutism will be trivially true. So we want to play Fein's game. Absolutism might be, false. So we cannot have classical quantification theory. Having a free logic is okay because this allows you to say that, oh, this fact exists at a time, doesn't exist at this other time. Okay. So that's basically the motivation. In blue, you have what's really specific to free logic. If you drop the things in blue, then you get classical quantification theory. Okay, so very few modifications. Now for content identity, and that's where things become crucial and crucial for our purposes. We also use classical postulates for it. So reflexivity and Leibniz's law without any restriction. That's the same as with standard identity. So there's no funny business, if you wish, here with content identity. Later on, when we go higher order, you will see that there will be funny business something going on. But in the first level setting, there's no special thing going on. And we also use classical classification theory for the sentential operators. So we don't need to say, oh, this content exists at a time, but perhaps not at this other time. Contents are not the problematic entities, they are all things, if you wish, right? It's really the facts, fact existence, which is potentially problematic. So we use classical quantification theory for that. So the high order logic here is fully classical, nothing bizarre about identity or quantification. Okay. How we deal with the temporal operators? Well, we don't need to worry about that. We just assume that we have linear timeline, and then that's the thing. Okay, now we start with the classification. Okay, so that's the first order setting, and then after that we move on to the higher order setting. So now we're starting to do metaphysics with the language that I have just introduced. So we define three categories of things, or three predicates: state of affairs, fact, and tense fact, using our content attribution predictive. We have it, we didn't have it in our earlier characterization. Now we have it, and then we use it just to characterize these. So tau is a state of affairs, okay? You understand that tau has a content. Okay? Having a content is what is really specific to states of affairs. That's what states of affairs are. They are entities with contents. What is a fact? Well, a fact is just a state of affairs that sometimes obtains more rigorously. A fact is something that has a content that sometimes is the case, right? So you would have in that setting some states of affairs which do not obtain. There would be the state of affairs of me being both sitting and not sitting. Okay. At least the theory allows for that. We could exclude that. We could have an specific action and say we don't have these things. But for the purpose of the classification of used by tense-realism, we don't need to have that. So a fact is something that has a content, which is sometimes the case. And a tense fact is something that has a content, which is sometimes the case and sometimes not the case, right? So that these are natural ways of defining these three categories of entities using the content attribution predictive. given the definition, obviously, all tense facts must be facts and all facts must be states of affairs. It's just like a logical concept, basically logical. All right. As I said, we allow for impossible states of affairs, but we could just as well just add an axiom that we exclude them. That could not be a problem. And we also allow for possible states of affairs whose content is never the case. That's also something. So my being, I don't know, Spanish, okay, is not a state of affairs. That is sometimes the case. It's just merely possible. And the definition of state of affairs provided here is compatible with there being such a state of affairs. Of course, that would be a state of affairs that is not a fact. Now you might say, and I've heard that in the very first presentation of the material that I gave a few months ago, you might think, well, that's not a very standard definition of fact, okay? It would be, as I say here, more in line with familiar ways of talking about facts. So we find the fact as something that is that has a content which is the case, not which is sometimes the case, but which is the case, right? But that's not the way we think Fine uses the word fact. When he talks about facts, he has that more liberal conception of facts according to which they are states of affairs which are sometimes the case, right? We respect this way of using the word fact here. Two principles about content attribution. They are quite important when you develop the theory, actually. One is that states of affairs have at most one content. So what that means, that really stipulates that when you attribute the content to a state of affairs, you exhaust the content of the state of affairs. So when you say that X is the fact that P, for instance, using the old idiom, okay, X is the fact that P, then you've said all there is to say about the contents of X. Okay, there's no like extra material that you need to add to just fully specify your content X has. So this axiom just formalizes or expresses this idea. Again, this is a stipulation because we could decide to use content in a weaker way, where facts might have different kinds of contents. What we call content could be just the sum of all the contents of the fact that's don't do that. But this is something that we, well, today, and that's not going to be relevant in a general theory of content attribution. You would have presumably this axiom that says that the state of affairs is an eternal property. So you cannot be, sometimes a state of affairs and sometimes not. I should perhaps here conditionalize. So the principle should be, if you're a state of affairs, then always when you exist, you're a state of affairs. That could be perhaps a weaker, more plausible principle. But again, we won't use that. I won't use that today. So that's not very important. Now, okay, we move to the taxonomy. So we move first to the formulation of the various principles that Fine uses, and we do that with the new language that we just introduced. So realism says that there's at least one tense fact. Okay, that is, according to our definition, the state of affairs whose content is sometimes the case and sometimes isn't. That's how it is true. Realism, variegation in English, there is a tense fact X such that at some other time there exists another tense fact with a content that's opposite to the content of the first fact. Okay, so that's the natural way of formulating variegation in that setting. Neutrality, there presently exists some tense fact, and there also exists some tense fact at some non-present time. We express that using our definitions, and that's the way of doing it. Absolutism, every state of affairs exists, every state of affairs exists at all times. So that's the obvious formulation given our definitions. And we have finally fixed content and coherence. Fixed content states of affairs have the same contents at any time at which they exist. Okay, that's the obvious translation in our formal language. And finally, coherence facts with opposite contents never coexist. So that's again, so if you read the formula, that would be the natural way of expressing that. Okay. So it's just you take the old principles and then you just translate them using the new definitions and the new language. And that's basically the natural way of doing so. Now, you might perhaps at some point say, oh, perhaps here you should have had a condition, or perhaps we can discuss about that. But roughly, at least, that sounds like a good way to get. Shifty contents, I'm not going to bore you with that. So I invented a new kind of syntax and operator, but that's really, so that's not super important here. The important thing is that using the language that we've introduced, then we can express the alternative to fixed content, shifty content, keeping the spirit of the principle as I have formulated it before. So anyway, it's not necessary to go to the details there. Now we can prove, like Fine did, okay, but here now we're more careful because we were explicit about fixed content. We can prove that variation, which replaces neutrality in our setting, absolutism, fixed content, which Fine did have, and coherence are inconsistent, and that will give us the classification of the new classification of tense. So the argument is pretty simple, but in variation there's a tense fact X with content at P. For some given P, right? So it has a certain content P. And at some non-present time Z, there is another tense fact with content not P. So two facts with opposite content, okay, at different time. By absolutism, X, which presently exists, right, also exists at Z because, fact existence is not relative to time. So if the fact exists now, it will always exist. So X also exists at Z. And so by fixed content, and that's where fixed content plays a role, it still has then at Z the content at P. So it has it now, it also has it then. And that's crucial. If you don't have fixed content, you cannot make that move, and then the argument is blocked there. Okay. But then at Z, there are two facts with opposite contents. Okay? X with content P, and this other fact with content not P, and that's a violation of coherence. Okay, so the argument is very straightforward. Even though we use higher order resources in formulating the principles, the argument is really straightforward. Now here is the classification of views that you have. So you still have, so we start with realism. Instead of having not neutrality plus neutrality, we use the alternative, the variegation principle. That's really the engine that Fine uses in his argument. On the left, you have the choice between having neutrality or not. If you don't have it, you have what Fine calls presentism. Okay. If you have it, then you have like a super boring view where, yes, there are several types and different facts, and facts, tense fact at different times, but that's the same fact, the same content. Right? So that's not interesting. Then you have relativism. Fine has that in his classification, and you see dynamic absolutism in the picture. So that's the view that Sven and I defended in that way. Okay. So that's it. So now we have the new classification. It's a bit richer. It has actually two more views. The one where you have the exclamation mark, which is not interesting at all, so you can forget about it, and the dynamic absolutist view, which rejects fixed content. And again, that view is most naturally understood as accepting instead shifty content, even though it's not logically implied that it has to be. Now we go higher order. Okay. So that's where the more tricky things happen. Okay, so the background, I talked a little bit about the background earlier. You might think there are two general options for quantifying over states of affairs, using first order nominal quantifiers, as we did before, as I did before, or using higher order sentential quantifiers. So the idea is that when you say for some P blah blah blah, you're doing something like state of affairs quantification, etc. One motivation for going that way is nominalism. So that's the motivation that Arthur Prior had when he advertised sentential quantifiers. He said, look, when you say that John believes that 2 + 2 = 4, and Maria believes that 2 + 2 = 4, therefore, there's something that they both believe. You can formalize that using for some P, one believes that P, and the other one believes that P. He says, well, he argues that, well, we are not quantifying really over domain objects, right? There are no entities which correspond to these quantifiers. So that's the kind of nominalist take on these quantifiers. So that could be one motivation that you have for using higher order sentential quantifiers to in fact talk. Another one, which is actually anti-nominalist, and which is quite trendy, fashionable nowadays, is this. There are these entities, the states of affairs, okay, alongside bottles and people, but they cannot be in the range of the first order quantifier, or they cannot even be, obviously, designated by standard names. Right? What you need is special expressions to denote them and special quantifiers to range over them. And the expressions are like predicates or sentences or adverbs, depending on what kind of entity you have in mind. And the corresponding quantifier are sentential quantifier into predicate positions or so forth. So this is really anti-nominalist because these people Jeremy Goodman, Nick Jones, and others, I mean, they really say there are these entities, but it's simply that they cannot be, captured by first order resources. Right? So I don't like the second route for the first one, but that was just to explain to you why one might be interested in moving from the first order classification, the first order setting, when classifying first order views about tense-realism, sorry, and go for the high order setting instead. Now here is a problem raised by Lukas Skiba. I briefly mentioned the problem in the introduction. We call fixed content. So it says that if a fact has a content at P, then whenever that fact exists, it has that very same content. Okay, it doesn't change content over time. That's the principle that is rejected by dynamic absolutism. Okay, dynamic absolutism says, no, that's not correct. Okay, and perhaps we should have shifty contents instead. Now, what he argues for, what Skiba argues for, is that when you go higher order, when you try to translate the fixed content principle from higher order languages, then it becomes a logical truth. Okay, so you cannot just say, oh, I don't agree with that. It's a logical truth. And if he's right, then of course there's no room for dynamic absolutism because the key feature of the view is rejection of fixed content. Skiba has a slogan which is tricky because it took me a while to just disentangle what's said there. But he says, while first order states of affairs have content, okay, and that's really what we have now, way of expressing content attribution, X has the content at P. Higher order states of affairs are contents. They are the P's, okay? They are not the X's, they are the P's, right? So this is of course not very, it's not a precise claim. But the view that is supposed to be supported by the slogan and which he makes explicit is this one. In a higher order setting, content attributions take the form of identities, content identities, rather than content attributions. So instead of saying that, tau, the fact tau has the content of alpha, you say the content that beta and the content of alpha are one and the same thing. I see Kevin frowning, and you're right, because when you see that, you think, why should that be the case? And actually, I'm going to react to that precise point. Okay. Now, suppose that he's right. So now I repeat fixed content, and I repeat his claim that content attributions take the form of identity rather than properly content attributions. Once you have that, then here is how fixed content gets translated. Okay, so we replace X by Q. So now you quantify not first order of the facts, but higher order. So that's for all Q rather than for all X. And instead of having X has the content at P, you have the content that Q is the content that Q, that P. Okay, that we really follow Skiba's suggestion. Okay? And you do the same in the consequence. So X was so the content attribution is the same. And in order to express fact existence, well, you use higher order quantification and the content identity connectives, and that's the natural translation of the existence condition. All right, so that's the way, given Skiba's assumptions, one naturally translates fixed content. And actually, he's right that this is a logical truth, at least given a very plausible logic. So he's saying that this is a logical truth. Now, this looks like the necessity of identity. That's just a condition of existence, but the necessity of identity or the eternality of identity would be to say for all x and y, if x is identical to y, then always x is identical to y. Necessarily x. That's so here you have an extra condition on existence, but you don't need to care about that because there is this this well-known Park and Crick key proof of the necessity of identity. So for standard identity, which makes uses of Leibniz's law for standard identity, the reflexivity of standard identity, the rule of necessitation for always, like if blah blah is a theorem, always blah blah is a theorem, higher order generalization, which is classically valid, and principles of the propositional calculus. So I didn't bother to write down the proof. And the idea is that this is a proof for standard identity, first order identity. But if you have the same principles for content identity, then the proof, of course, will go through in the same way. So you might think, perhaps there we should just deny that higher order identity, content identity behaves classically as first order identity. But the problem is that our own logic has all these principles. I insisted that for content identity and content quantification, in sentential position, our logic, the logic that I presented before, is completely classical. Okay, so we have a problem. Okay, we have a problem because that translation of fixed content is a logical truth. So what's the reaction? Okay, so the reaction, of course, is going to be to deny that that thing in blue there is the correct translation of fixed content. Okay. And actually, what we will, so that will be our answers, but you will see along the way that we cannot preserve Leibniz's law for content identity, despite that modification that's going to do. The logic of the higher order logic that I'm going to introduce will tell you, well, you have to restrict the Leibniz's law. Anyway. So that's the very last, the final sprint to the end of this presentation. So what I'm going to do here is two things. The first one is to motivate a certain higher order language and logic, okay, not in all technical details, and I'm going to motivate it semantically. So I'm going to, there will be this higher order language, and I'm going to say, okay, you interpret it that way, you give that interpretation, you give this or that element of the, and then this will allow us to see how the logic of linked to that language works. And then once this is done, I'll be able to translate all the principles, including fixed content, and we will see that that what we have in the end is really basically the same classification as before, and we will be able to save dynamic absolutism. So that's the plan. So the higher order language and semantics that I'm going to present now are extremely non-standard. So of course, when you do something like that, then it's a bit risky because there might be some things that you've seen, and then someone in the room say, "Oh, look, and there's that," and then you have a problem. Okay. Okay. So first starting point. In the first order setting, we took sentential terms, so sentences and sentential variables, to express contents. Okay. you could see that when we have these content identity statements, okay, alpha, triple bar, beta, well, we understood that as, you know, the content that alpha is identical with content that. So if you, okay, so we still keep that idea that there is this dimension to the semantics of sentences. But now we go somehow Phrygian, and we say, look, there are two levels of semantic content, okay, or semantic value. Okay, I don't want to use content because content is used here to express in the mouth fact content, or factual content. So it's not the content of an expression, it's the content of the fact. So I'm going to use semantic value. So the idea is that a sentence has two semantic values. It expresses a content like before, okay, in the old setting, but it also denotes a state of affairs. So that's up to some point Phrygian. Phrygian would say, no, not state of affairs, truth value. But the two-level articulation is similar. As you will see, there are other differences. So we're just slightly Phrygian, and in many respects, we're not Phrygian at all. Okay, so that's one key thing, and that's really initially the key thing. We have these two levels of semantic value, and you see that, and I guess you start to anticipate what the story will be. It's not going to be trivial, but the idea basically will be, oh, once you have the state of affairs and the content, then you can reproduce the content attribute kind of articulation that we had before. But as you will see, again, it's not going to be trivial at all. So that's very good. So to be precise, we associate with every sentence, okay, two semantic functions, okay, a content function from times to contents that tell you which content that sentence has at any one time, okay, and a state of affairs function that tells you at any time, first, whether the sentence denotes a state of affairs that might happen, that might fail to happen, and if it happens, which one is designated. Okay, so two functions. Here we are non-Phrygian already, because for Phrygian, the content of a sentence will not vary across time. Okay, what varies across time will vary across time. The reference of the sentence might vary. The content will. In our setting, the content of a sentence may vary, and that's going to be crucial. That's very non-standard. I'm going to come back to that later on. Okay, so that's the way formally we implement the idea of the two semantic values. And then we use the content attribution connective. Okay, now it's a connective, it's not a prenective, it's not X has the content that P, it's you have two sentences, okay, one on the left and one on the right. This thing here, a square subset symbol alpha square subset symbol beta, can be read as the state of affairs that alpha has the content that beta. Okay, and given that alpha and beta have both content as semantic values, both a state of affairs dimension and a content dimension, this makes sense given the semantic assumptions that I've made before. And we take these claims to be true, such a claim to be true at a time, if and only if, and that's completely natural. First of all, the sentence does designate something, state of affairs at that time. Okay, so that's what the first conjunct says. And the second conjunct says that at time t, that state of affairs has the content expressed by the sentence at that time. So that's what. So that's the mathematically precise formulation, and even an informal gloss on that. So that's really the idea of expressing content attribution. You have the articulation between state of affairs and content, and you keep that. Okay. Two stipulations, and they are. So I will probably not have time, perhaps during the Q&A next time, but we'll have like to at least to fully justify two assumptions. The first one says that if a sentence designates state of affairs at a time, then at that time, that state of affairs has the content expressed by the sentence at that time. Okay. That seems to be very natural, but at least it's a principle that's not, it's not a logical truth. And second principle, if at a given time, the content expressed by a sentence at that time is had by some state of affairs, then the state of affairs designated by that sentence at that time has that same. So maybe other state of affairs have that content, but at least this one will have it. Two notions of rigidity are defined, and there are natural notions to define here. You say that a sentence is state of affairs rigid when it never designates any distinct state of affairs. So either it designates no state of affairs or always. So that's rigidity. It's a fairly standard notion of rigidity. And for a content rigidity, you go to the content side. So a sentence is content rigid when its content is always the same across time. So Frege would say, well, every sentence is content rigid. Okay? And we say, perhaps some are not. And perhaps in English, all of them are content rigid, but in the formal language that we introduce, some of them will not be content rigid. And precisely anticipating a bit, according to shifty content, that will be the case. Precisely being that since fact can change their contents over time, then the content of the state of affairs will be able to vary. And that's what is really behind this idea of being non-content rigid. Okay, so we take it that English sentences that keep finally are content rigid. Actually, we presuppose that in the first order setting, there was no reason to think that the content of these sentences would vary across time. As I said, according to dynamic absolutism and in fact other tense-realist views, maybe these very same sentences which are content rigid are, according to certain views, not as rigid. So if you don't need to be dynamic absolutist for that. I'm sitting now, so here is a sentence. It designates a state of affairs. Suppose that I'm sitting like in 5 minutes and just use the same sentence. I'm sitting now. On some views, or many views, I guess, the fact designated is not the same. Okay, it's like they are localized, if you wish, so to speak, at different times, and therefore they're not the same facts, even though they may have the same content. Okay, now we are close to being able to reformulate the principles and to establish the classification. We enrich the language with 3 more elements, and if I remember correctly, that's going to be all in terms of enrichment of the language. We have a notion of state of affairs rigidity for a sentence, and we introduce a connective that goes with that. And so you see here the truth conditions for that connective of state of affairs rigidity. This is R1. The truth conditions are just obvious. R1 alpha holds at T if alpha is S rigid. Okay, and same for R2 and C rigidity. And the third connective is a new one. So remember, we had the content identity connective already in the original language. Now that we have a second level of semantic value, state of affairs, we have, or it's very natural to add a new connective that expresses identities between states of affairs. And the truth conditions for state of affairs identities are the obvious one. Okay. So that's not really there's nothing surprising. Okay. I never gave you the truth conditions for content identities. Here they are, and that's completely natural. There's nothing special here. Okay, I forgot. Yeah, there was one small step. It's not very small that I forgot to mention. So here we are. We have a new language. Yes, that's absolutely perfect. Yes, we have a new language. So you remove the content connective. We're not talking about first order facts having the content. So we get rid of that, and we replace it by the new content attribution connective. We have, in addition, as I just said, the state of affairs identity operator, and the 2 rigidity operators, and that's the new language. So the modifications of the old language are not that big, right? So you remove one element and you add 4 elements instead. We have these rigidity operators that allows us to define something that works like rigid variables. Okay. The idea here is that we want to be able to do something like quantifying exclusively over states of affairs. And we also want to do something that looks like quantifying exclusively over content. We cannot really do that because we have these semantic values which have 2 sides, okay? So we don't have 2 elements. But using the rigidity operators, we can mimic that, okay? Just by restricting, we say for all P, R1P, if R1P, then that amounts to quantifying over the level of states of affairs, because you will always, with variable P, always stay with the same state of affairs in any further predication. Okay. And you can do that also with R2. So these are ways of, again, mimicking specific quantification over state of affairs and specific quantification over contents. Okay, so the logic of classical sentential quantification remains classical. That's very important because when you start messing around with quantification theory, things can become very much of a nightmare very quickly. Okay, so the logic of quantification, sentential quantification, remains classical. Now you will need to restrict Leibniz's law for content attribution. Okay, and the source of that, we can discuss that in the Q&A, is basically that contents are not constant, necessarily constant over time. Okay, so the sentences will work as somehow definite descriptions over contents, and given that the contents can vary, can vary over time. Okay, then a given sentence will not express the same content over time. So that's why essentially you need to restrict Leibniz's law and to say, well, there are certain contexts which are opaque for that relation, for that connective, and you have to specify the restrictions. Same thing for state of affairs identity for the same reason, because the given sentence can designate different states of affairs at different times. And that was already the case in the old setting. Okay. So you also will need to restrict them. Okay. So these are big changes. Okay, and these are big things. But that's the way it should go. You need to add postulates for the new connectives, the new operators. I'm not going to bother you with that. And then now we start the translation. We move higher on. And you will see that this is, even the work that has been done, this is super boring because it's just, well, up to some point. And then there are some more interesting things, but at the very beginning, that's completely mechanical. Okay. So these are the original definitions. So in the ones that I gave in the first one setting. And then here is what we adopt instead. So look at the definition of state of affairs. Now, we had, of course, standard predications. SOR was a regular first order predicate, and tau was singular, like a nominal expression. Now we replace that by a sentential expression. That's the game. We go higher order. And look at what we do here. We say that the content attribution takes the form of a content attribution. So we use the square subset symbol, but we are cautious in that we specify that we basically, the idea here is that we want to quantify specifically over contents and not over these indiscriminate semantic values, which have two sides, right? So basically what SOA alpha, the definition says is that there is in effect a content such that the state of affairs that alpha has that content. And there, whenever the variable P2 will appear later on, you will be sure that we will be talking about the very same content, even though it might appear within like the scope of any type of operator. Okay. So you mimic quantification over contents by using these P2 variables, which are again standard variables but restricted to the rigid ones, if you will. And you do that systematically, and you get all the definitions that you have here. Okay, so that's mechanical. Now, the principles that have been used in the arguments, the inconsistency argument. These are the original principles, okay, first order principle. And then you also go higher order in a very automatic way. So here we still do what we used to do, what we did when I mentioned that in the previous slide. Whenever there was a content, quantification of a content, we used it for some P2 because we want to be sure that we capture always the same content, whatever the context. And the new thing here is that we replace quantification over first order facts by higher order quantification, but restricted to the state of affairs rigid ones. Because again, we want to limit quantification over these things. And we want to be sure that once we've introduced a quantifier of that sort, a variable of that sort, then in any further context, then it would become the very same state of affairs. Okay. So these are the two things here. The last difference is you replace standard identity by state of affairs identity. But that's okay because you wanted to express fact identity within usual regular identities. And the proper way of doing that here is to use the new state of affairs identity. Okay, so that's all mechanical, and obviously I'm not going to go through that, but the old proof of inconsistency just carries over to the higher counterparts. Okay, right. So that's it. Now, I'm not going to spend time on neutrality, shifting content. You have the same sort of automatic translation. Now, that was all very automatic. Now, here is one way of nicely simplifying the characterizations and the definitions. You adopt two general principles, which amount to axioms for rigidity. The first one says that for any semantic value, if you wish, like these complex kind of semantic values with two faces, there is a content rigid one with which it is identical, such that contents are identical. So the idea here is basically whenever you use a sentential quantifier, universal sentential quantifier, then you can always then focus on the context of that is introduced, okay, and then just ignore the possible variations in content. And the second principle says the same thing, but about the first the state of affairs rigid variables. Now these are principles that are very substantial. They have some plausibility, and once you have them, then you can simplify something. So, for instance, remember the definition of state of affairs. It had these funny P2, variables, but given the first axiom, then you can just drop that. So you can just have the regular for some P, the fact, the state of affairs that alpha has the content that P, and that's completely equivalent thanks to this axiom. Similarly, you can simplify realism. So instead of having for some Q1 TF Q1, you can just drop the decoration and have for some Q TF Q, and that's going to be completely equivalent. Okay, and same with coherence. You can simplify. You cannot simplify everywhere. Okay, and in particular, you cannot simplify in fixed contents. Right. So we can talk about that very briefly, and that's going to be basically the end of the presentation. So there are certain connections between the various notions, new notions that I've introduced, that are interesting and that lead to a final result, which is perhaps a bit puzzling. So I mentioned this principle, semantic principle PS1, which I think I said I wouldn't use, but in fact I use it here. Okay, so never mind. And given this principle and the principle that state of affairs never have more than one content, we had it, remember, in the first order setting, you can prove all of these things. So state of affairs identity implies the content claim. The content claim implies the content identity claim. if you have a content identity claim and that alpha is state of affairs identical with alpha, but that corresponds to the idea that there is a state of affairs that's designated by alpha, then you have the content attribution. And finally, if you have the content attribution, then you have the existence of a state of affairs designated by alpha. So forget about the details. The interesting thing is this. Given the last three principles, we could define content attribution, okay, in terms of content attribution in terms of content identity and state of affairs existence. Okay. So we could simplify the language and get rid of this content attribution connected. So this is interesting for several reasons. One is that, well, you have a simpler language, that's nice. Another one is that it's strange because the original idea was let's use a content attribution connective to express the claims and on the model of what we did in the first order setting. And there you see that given the semantic machinery, then you can just make do without it. And the third thing that's interesting is that, remember, Skiba said, the proper way of expressing content attributions in a higher order setting is by using these identities, this content identity. So we are very close to that because here it's not just an identity, but also a factual existence. But if you think of alpha as a fact that always exists, or if you think even that absolutism is true, then you would think, oh, but he's right. Okay, he's right that content attributions are expressible by means of identities. And that's where you will see that the contents, the business with rigid variables is crucial. Because let me go back to fixed contents. So here you see that you have these Q1 and P2, etc., and you have these content attributions which are here. But if you replace these content attributions, okay, by content identities, you still see that you don't have the same type of variables on the left and on the right. On the left, you have a state of affairs variable, and on the right, you have a content variable, essentially, right? So that means that yes, you can just make do with only content identities to express content attributions, but it's crucial that you use these two kinds of variables to formulate that. Okay, so he was partly right, okay, but not completely, because you need these extra resources to properly express the contents attributions, and that's it. That's fine.
Thanks a lot for Fabrice. Question time. Thank you for the field, Fabrice. Very interesting. So I have a very general and open-ended question. So as you probably know, some philosophers think that sometimes when you translate philosophical dispute about things like properties, facts, states of affairs, conditions, which are standardly correlated with the terms, when you translate that into higher order language, the dispute gets dissolved. So, for example, an example which is familiar, which some of the people here are familiar with, is the one between Aristotelians and Platonists about the location of universes. So I was wondering if, well, first of all, if the argument that you discussed is an instance of this general line of reason, and maybe more generally, what I want to ask you is that so you showed out that in the case of the dispute about the reality of things, you can translate that to another thing, and you preserve the substantiality of the dispute. So what I was wondering about is whether you think that there is like a general recipe to translate disputes from standardly converted into personal languages into other languages and by preserving the society.
Thanks. So that's a very interesting question. I don't think. Well, I wouldn't say that yes. I think there is a general recipe. The case that you mentioned is nice in this respect because so there were these entities. Okay, we first order quantify over the universals, and then there was the question: oh, given that they belong to the same world, if you wish, as tables and so on, then there's a question of whether you can find them or not, and if so, well. And then when you go higher order, then all of a sudden what's interesting here is that remember the contrast between the nominalist view, Prior's view, and the anti-nominalist view. For the nominalist view, of course, there you just completely remove the question in a way, because it's like you don't even have entities. So how do you want them to be located at times or at places, right? So that doesn't make any sense because, all right. But if you go on the other camp, you say, oh, they are entities, but just of a special kind, and you cannot refer to them using standard names and so on and so forth. Then the question is still open, right? So you wouldn't need at least extra arguments to say, even in that case, the dispute doesn't make any sense. So you could argue that, but then you could say something like, even in that case, these entities don't belong to the same realm, okay? So they cannot be connected to like in a location way to times, let's say, because of that. But then that's really doing heavy duty metaphysics, and whereas the priori view that then there's no metaphysics, at least no substantial metaphysics that's involved. Now, I was trying to think of so two more things. One is so applying this strategy to the property strategy would be doing something like you have this higher order properties or perhaps and then you talk about places, let's say, into higher order language. So, but then it's not clear at all what that could look like. But if you could do that, then you could presumably apply the same sort of strategy. But it's not clear at all how you could perform that sort of translation. And the other thing I wanted to add to that about this idea of a very general recipe, it's not. I mean, here we introduce a very non-standard high order language to do what we want to do, right? If you use Skiba's standard, simply type language, then that's that. There's no way you can do that. And in general, in that literature, you realize that depending on which language you use, you will be able to do some things or not. Or you have this, Russell-Myhill paradox, but you don't have it anymore if you go for another kind of higher order language. And so what you can do is very sensitive to the kind of language that you use. So that will certainly not be like a general recipe in terms of, in the sense of use the same language or same kind of language and apply the same method, because the language will change, at least in some cases, anyway. That's
other questions. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, this is just like a small clarification. So in the first order formulation, there is a connective for the content connective, and there you have to formulate facts as saying that facts have contents, and the contents are what is the case. And this goes against how I would like traditionally think of facts. Facts are what is the case, not their contents. But in the higher order formulation, I'm not sure if I get the connective properly, but do we still need to say that facts are not what is the case, but it's the contents that are the case? So maybe this is close to why I think maybe my intuition along what Skiba was suggesting.
Yeah.
Facts are contents.
It sounds like that, but So there is, okay, so let's start with the very original formulation where you have these identities. X is identical to the fact that P, so that you don't have a problem with that. No, you have a problem with the second level, X has the content. Now, how does the, so you said something like it's contents that are the case.
In your formulation, yeah. So it's there is a content.
Yeah.
The fact has that content, and the content is the case.
Ah,
Sometimes.
I don't think.
Sometimes.
Yeah, no. I think officially I didn't say that. I said it, but not officially. So yeah. So the definition of fact is so that there's some X that has the as for some P, X has the content at P and P, right? Or right. And perhaps I said and P is the case.
So, I think
something like
that. 18.
Sorry?
I think it's 18.
Okay, so let me go to 18 rather than.
For the first level.
Yeah.
So the point was.
Yeah, okay. So the English translation of the formula says, okay, is sometimes the case. The official formulation would be for some P, tau has to contain that P and sometimes P. I don't use formulation of like the case. Or I could say it's sometimes the case that P. Would that be a problem? So
No,
actually, I'm not sure I get
my
that.
intuition was just that, like if tau is a fact, then I should be able to say tau, not P. But of course, I can't in the first order. Then okay. But in the higher order setting, like I would identify them with certain.
Yeah, so that's exactly Skiba's
Yes,
Skiba's intuition. Yeah. And then yes, what I can offer is my two-level semantics. You know, like saying that when you say P, if you go Freudian, when you say P, you haven't just expressed the contents. You've done something more. And of course, you can object to that, but that's really the key thing there.
Yeah, so it is actually related. I was wondering what is your final stance was Skiba's motto that in the higher order context, facts don't have content but are content. No, it was something like this. And I was wondering whether you are rejecting this in the end, that they are bound to reject this. Because in the higher order context, you have to make this distinction, right? Between expressing and denoting. So you seem to be bound to reject this.
So the claim has two parts. So we reject, the claim, given that there's the locution while, what is that it implies that first order, higher order facts don't have context. That's not saying, but that's implied. So we would deny that higher order state of affairs. Yes, they do have content, and that's really what we try to articulate in the best possible way in this higher order language. Okay. Now, what about the view that higher order states of affairs are also contents? I think here there's an ambiguity between content in the sense of content of a fact and content in the sense of content of a linguistic expression. Okay. Instead of semantic value, people use content. Okay. And when you say that there are two levels of semantic values, you can really say that there are two levels of contents for linguistic expressions. So content is really ambiguous here between what is expressed or something that is semantically expressed by a sentence and something that facts have, like properties of facts. Okay, so any kinds of properties of facts. And so when he says that higher order states of affairs are contents, we would say, well, that's false in the sense of content that find has an identity in mind. They have them, they are not identical to them. But that's true in the sense of the linguistic sense of content. Yes, of course, because they are at the second level of the content. So they are contents of the same type, linguistic contents. So that the word content is ambiguous, and I was initially trapped by the ambiguity because I tried to disentangle what he was saying. Say what's that, and why does that support this claim? So yeah, exactly. That the content attribution should take that. But then I thought, well, no, I think he's the thing. I don't know if he has that in mind, but he's really playing with the ambiguity between. So I would say, in the higher order setting, that's the view that we have. States of affairs have finite content, okay, but yes, they are finite content, but it's also true to say that they are linguistic contents because they play the role of the contents reference of linguistic expression.
Yeah, there first. Thank you very much. So I have two questions. The first is a clarificatory one. So when you say that in this new line of that context, you will reject the Leibniz's law for identity. The notion of identity for which you reject the law is the notion of identity that you have defined in the new framework as having the same problem at certain time. Is that the notion?
I mean, the law
Sorry.
the law will have to be restricted for both this triple bar content identity connective and for the new state of affairs identity connective.
Oh, it's rejected for whole.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the rejection is of the unrestricted law because the idea is that you can formulate restricted notions which are acceptable.
Because I would think that once you go for you and in the way that you do, then identity between alpha and beta at a certain time, or identity between alpha and beta at a certain time should not just be that they have the same content at t, but I was thinking of something stronger, that is that at all times they have the same content, and at all times that they have been so the function associated with the state of affair, and maybe also that the state of affair function is undefined in the same times. And if you have this notional identity, then you can still have that.
Yeah.
I think this would be a better notional identity.
Okay, so of course, so I thought about that. So you can introduce a further notion in the language that would have the semantic set notion, and that would obey full Leibniz's law. Just we didn't need it, so we didn't do that. But it's easy to introduce, right? You say it would be a better notion. Well, I'm not sure, because sometimes you might want to identify contents, and sometimes you might want to identify states of affairs, rather than do it in that kind of very rigid way. So you would lose an expressive power in having just the very strong notion of identity that you have. So in a better version of that language, we would have this other notion, because that would increase the expressive power of the language. That's good. Full Leibniz's law, no problem. But we want to keep the other ones because so perhaps you don't want to call them identity connectives because they don't correspond to full maximal, absolute identity. Call them equivalents, whatever. But that we we need them if we want to be able to say certain things, right?
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that reject them. Professor.
Thank you, Fabrice. I would like to know a little bit more about this crucial notion of states of affairs having content. And it would help me to understand what exactly you have in mind. If you could say something about the following two questions. So first of all, when Frege says that sentences have contents. One way of understanding that is that sentences express a content. So a French sentence and an English sentence, which is a translation of it, they've got to express the same content, but express thought. That's one of the two things you call the later part of the talk semantic value. So in that case, the notion of having a content, we understand what it means because it's just a variant on this relation of expressing. There is a relation which we understand, and having a content is explained by using this relation of expressing. So you can guess my question. When a state of affairs has a content, is there any relation which will help us to understand has it universe? That's my first question. And the second question, which I think is very closely related to it, is when you have an instance of the state of affairs that P, so the state of affairs that Fine is sitting, what is your preferred account of the internal structure of this expression? Is it the case that the expression, the state of affairs of that operates on centers and creates a sort of nominal expression? Or is it the case that the expression, the state of affairs, operates on a vast clause and produces a sort of nominal expression?
Thanks. So the two questions are related indeed. There is in the all the paper, the 2012 paper that I've mentioned, Sven and I, at the very end of the paper, we have a section where we develop the ontology of facts and states of affairs, and where we articulate, try to give substance to this idea of having a content. So, and we do it that way. Perhaps before explaining, let me say that talking about facts having content really follows Fine's original way of formulating things. That's how it goes. And so we want to keep that because we want to work with the classification of tense-realist, with the views that he introduced. About the ontology of facts, so the thought here was, at least for the simple facts, you have like a regular conception of facts as constituted by objects and properties. So that the fact that the kit is sitting is constituted by kit Fine and the property of being sitting. And then the thought here is that what changes over time, okay, so is going to be in that fact the property, if you wish. So according to Shifty content, tomorrow that very same fact will still have kit as a subject, if you wish, but the property will be the property of having been sitting a day ago or something like that. So the contents for this very simple fact, the contents of facts would be this articulation into object property. So that would give you that's what, ontologically speaking, a content would be. You have this fact, and the content is really this division or articulation into object property. And according to some views, then the content will change over time, because at least the property will be different. Whereas on some other views, fixed content views, the property will be the same. But the short answer is a content is understood as just an articulation into object property. That's right. And there's nothing linguistic. So perhaps he was wrong, and people were wrong in following him, like calling that content, because that invites obviously the linguistic signification, and that's potentially a source of mistake. So yeah. So I don't.
Okay, so I can see that gives you that's an answer to the question for a certain sort of atomic state of affairs.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell you about anything else. And what I found a little bit more worrying is it doesn't even tell you what to do with impersonal state of affairs, like it's raining or it's raining now, which are not normally important, but in the case of tense, they are important.
No, of course.
Because it's raining now. That looks fairly atomic. Okay, but you may think that it is a property anyway.
Yeah, so we don't have a general account of contents for facts of all kinds. If I remember correctly in this paper, we were happy with that because we had like a sort of, logical atomistic sort of view where you just need the simple facts of that, and then the rest is.
And grammatical question?
Yeah.
Which expression takes which expression?
So one option was it's the fact that takes.
So the fact that fine is sitting.
Yeah, takes.
Does of the state of affairs that fine is sitting. Fine is sitting. Does the expression the state of affairs that take a sentence, or does the expression the state of affairs take that logic?
My preferred view is the first one, but yeah. So I guess unless there's something I don't see that I guess there's nothing that's really true with respect to the kind of things that we're doing here.
I think there is. If you go the second answer, which you don't, you very quickly led to say things like that he is identical with that you.
I see. Oh yeah.
And I think that's nonsense.
Yes. Okay. That's and actually we don't have that because we don't have any way of nominalizing sentences that way. So that's the first reply is in line with the way we formulate the language. That's
Super good. Okay. Good. Thank you. So I had some difficulty understanding what is the inherent meaning of the equivalences relations that you use. And I think something that without is this. So I was wondering, are you thinking of the meaning of the sentence as some sort of function that takes as input our or for example an instant time and as output as a certain state of affairs. So is the that the content is the function and the state of affairs is the output of the function at a certain time? Or is it something else? So this
I guess there are various ways to go. So the way we go here is this. To each sentence, there are two functions, not just one, which are associated. So one that takes care of the content, and the other one of the state of affairs designated by the sentence. Okay. So you can see that. So the meaning, if you wish, is a pair of functions. Okay.
also it's not the content that picks out the state of affairs.
No. In Frege, the content picks out the state of affairs. Okay. Here, that's another non-Freudian thing. So you can these state of affairs rigid sentences will behave like that. They will always pick out the same state of affairs. But if dynamic absolutism is true, then the contents that pick out the sentence will change all the time, right? So yeah, so that's non-Freudian. That's another non-Freudian aspect of the views. Again, what's Freudian is just the idea that there's some articulation in terms of into content and state of affairs. And yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking for this.
Yeah, man.